Welcome to the VegasInsider.com Bet and Collect podcast.
I'm here to collect.
Hosted by Kevin Rogers.
Who's the big winner here tonight at the casino?
Your source for the best sports betting information to help you dominate your bookmaker.
Thought you was laying.
I'm laying. No, I'm taking it. I was taking it.
It's time to bet and collect.
Welcome to the latest edition of the Bet and Collect podcast here on VegasInsider.com for Wednesday, March the 25th. Kevin Rogers and Tony Mejia with you. We are still quarantined. We are still trying to get through this. No Sweet 16 this week, but at least some things to talk about, Tony. And obviously, and I always hate doing this because I think it's pointless, you know, when you do like radio shows or podcasts to say like, how are you? But in this scenario, I'm going to give an exception. So how is everything going without the sports?
Well, without sports, it's, you kind of have to fend for yourself. I've been watching the Tiger King doc on Netflix, been supervising my preschooler doing her Zoom preschool lessons, which is fun. And hats off to all the teachers out there who are going the extra mile and doing that type of thing. You know, sports-wise, I watched the Women of Troy doc on HBO. That was fantastic. Watched a little Dark Side of the Ring and really just trying to maintain. How are you doing?
Getting there. You know, I will watch any replay of any game that is on, even if I don't even remember what happened, you know, just to see something. If it's on any of the ESPN networks, if it's on SEC network. There was an Ole Miss Mississippi State basketball game. I think it was the finale from this past season. It was on just because it's on. It's something. So just trying to get through it like everyone else. But I guess we'll transition into predictions right now. We're going to talk some NFL coming up with the quarterbacks in the market like Cam Newton and Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton and where they're going to land. But I want to discuss this first, Tony, that when do we think these leagues will either start again or, in the case of Major League Baseball, begin? I want to start with the NBA because we don't know how this is going to go as far as, A, if they're going to continue the season, B, if they're going to continue but start with the postseason, or C, just bag the whole thing because we're getting close to summer, contracts are up, and it gets a little messy of the draft. So I guess I'll ask you first, how do you think this is going to be handled? Because I can't even give you a prediction. Honestly, I can see trying to play a few regular season games so you don't start the playoffs immediately. I could see them bagging it, but you know, you would hope it's mid-May, early June. I'm just not that confident it's going to be that early.
Let me preface this with a caveat of saying we're getting mixed messages from the people that know the most about this pandemic. This is just a guess, and it's the same one I had when this all broke, that the NBA was kind of the tipping point of the calamity that occurred next, and maybe it will be one of the first leagues that is back. And that's certainly Mark Cuban's sentiment in his most recent interview, I think, that he gave to ESPN or somebody else. So my apologies to whoever it was, but he targeted mid-May. And I know the NBA stance has been June. I agree with June being likely. But if we do get into a situation where a lot of these guys are cleared and we get testing as widely available as we need it, to make sure that everybody's going to be safe, I could see late May training camps. I think it's key for everybody to come back, Kevin, not just playoff teams, even though I think the playoffs should be set. My stance has been that we should get an abbreviated end to the regular season, 5 to 7 games, with geography playing the biggest role in where these games are held and probably not being held with fans. And then we transition into the postseason. And in the playoffs, maybe by the time the end of the first round rolls around, we'll be able to let fans into arenas. But I certainly think that the NBA will start up without attendance in the stands.
What I'm afraid of is what's going on in New York. And everyone can make their Knicks jokes or whatever. Oh, the Knicks, who cares if they even play again? But it's really, it's really a big concern that when you look at what's going on in New York and New York City, that how can they have the Knicks and Nets, or at least teams, travel to Madison Square Garden and play, or at Barclays Center and play? And that's kind of one thing where, again, you can't ban two teams from the league for however long, and they're both not, well, the Nets could make the playoffs, the Knicks obviously aren't. But that's the other thing I wonder, that you need to have almost everybody included in this thing. And another point I want to bring up to you is we're almost, I guess, at the 2-week mark. We're closing in with Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell of the Jazz and want to kind of curious to see how they're doing, in a sense that if they're clear, that would make things obviously a lot better as opposed to if they went the other way.
Right. And Donovan Mitchell, I think, has been pretty public. He's regularly on Twitch. I think he's come out of it a little bit. And now we'll see what the post-recovery thing is. Like, is this similar to a flu where a couple of days after being depleted, we feel better? I'm not really sure. And we also have, you mentioned that New York is at this point the epicenter of what's going on in this country. Will more Nets and Knicks become affected? Obviously, the Nets already had the biggest breakout of everybody involved, Kevin Durant, the player publicly named. And, I think that probably blows up his return. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. And then if we have outbreaks in other parts of the country going forward over the next couple of weeks, does that completely put this at a halt? Or do we enter a situation, which I think you were alluding to, where we have to send these teams away from those spots and they're exclusively playing road games?
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how the NBA handles it. I was just reading about the NHL that they asked, apparently there was a source that asked, could these teams all provide home dates in August? I mean, we're going to go that far, and the NHL starts with training camp in September. So that'll be interesting to see how they handle it, because they're almost at the same point of the regular season as the NBA is, if not further along, where they only have a few games before the playoffs. I'm sure they want to get that done. So we'll see how that one goes. But then you have Major League Baseball that was supposed to have opening day on Thursday. And obviously, it's not going to happen now. And you would think that the target for them would be the beginning of June. They want to have a few weeks of spring training before they get started, which is understandable. But I don't think, Tony, that they're going to start at the beginning of June. I think that July could be more realistic for them, just because you need to have things cleared. Then these guys need a few weeks to get back into playing shape, and they haven't even started the season yet.
Right, and I think this is a situation where the Major League Baseball needs to say, we're not going to play 162 games. Season's too long anyway. Maybe that becomes something that they adopt going forward. I certainly think, and you're much better versed at the NHL than me, but in the NBA, I think they'll use this as a way to compete now with with MLB and try to avoid the NFL. I don't think starting as late as Christmas Day is in the cards, but I certainly think we could get Thanksgiving season openers.
Oh, I agree totally that the NBA should start later. That when you had the lockout a few years ago, of course, nobody agrees with 3 games and 3 nights. But the 66 games I thought was perfect, that you still had the best teams in the league in the playoffs. You didn't have any flukes in there, that you still can decide. You can look at the playoff picture right now, Tony, after these teams have played, 64, 65, 66 games, somewhere in that range. And there's no disputing Milwaukee's a 1 seed and the Lakers are a 1 seed. There's no disputing that. Those are the best teams so far in the league. Granted, the bottom of the East isn't great, but we knew that we don't need 82 games to decide that. We know that through 65 games. So really, yeah, the West, the 8 seed, it could go either way. But for the most part, your best teams are already in the playoffs, essentially.
No, absolutely. And I think New Orleans wants the full 82 to try and catch Memphis. If it's abbreviated, the Grizzlies have a pretty nice cushion. In the East, it's completely done. I mean, Bradley Beal is not going to go on a flurry that's going to catch either Brooklyn or Orlando. So you've got your 8 teams in the East. There are 10 teams. Portland, I think, is still in the mix, and San Antonio, I guess, is standings-wise. But for the most part, you got your 8 teams in the West. So I'm in agreement that the NBA season for this year should be abbreviated. And again, I think MLB, I know they played 144 before they went to 162. I think maybe go down to 132, get creative, and try to shoehorn in the season with the playoffs. And, next year, I think when we're talking about 2021 sports, I'm not sure about the NHL, like I said, kind of ignorant on that. But I think the NBA starts later, and Major League Baseball is poised to, again, begin in late March.
I'm okay with the NHL starting in October, but we could still knock out a few games. They can still knock off 6 or 8 games and still be fine. I don't think that they necessarily have to play the 82. It almost feels like in today's world, a lot of these big schedules are outdated, that we don't need to have these long seasons. We can cut it down. I mean, you don't have to cut the NBA season to 40 games, but you can still cut out 16 games and everything is still fine. Now, transitioning to football, we'll get to the NFL in a second, but for college football, Tony, just your take on this. I'm curious to see, after reading some stuff, I saw Paul Feinbaum of the SEC Network and even North Carolina head coach Mac Brown, where they're hearing if there may not be a season in college football. And when you're thinking about it, they've canceled spring football at basically all these campuses. And the difference between them and the NFL, you don't have to worry about kids coming back. At the NFL, you have your players coming back. And the NFL, it's unbelievable how they can have all of this happen. Yeah, the draft is a little – it's not going to be the big party they thought they'd have in Vegas, but how the NFL could still be fine. But college football, I wouldn't be shocked if that one didn't go just because of all the circumstances surrounding it with all the kids coming back, and they want to be careful.
No, it's touch and go. You figure that they start up conditioning in late June, July. We've already skipped out on all the spring football stuff. Right now, you're expecting these kids to stay in shape, to ramp up to the season like it's going to start on time. And then you combat what is the unforeseen at this point. What is this doing to society? Can we have a football team of 80 players congregating in a locker room every single day? They don't do two-a-days anymore, but for intense practices that are required to get teams ready to go by late August, early September. So I don't know. I hope we have a college football season because that'll mean that we probably got through this all okay, but nobody can say that for sure right now.
Now looking at the NFL, let's go over some betting notes here. And we saw, obviously, last week with free agency starting, Tom Brady goes to Tampa Bay, and Teddy Bridgewater ends up leaving New Orleans to go to Carolina. And the Panthers end up releasing Cam Newton. And he only played in 2 games this past season, was injured. He's been banged up the last few years. And I don't want to say, Tony, we haven't seen a fall from grace like this, but Cam Newton in 2015 won the MVP. He had the Panthers in the Super Bowl against Denver, and they did not play well at all. The Broncos totally shut them down. But Cam Newton, a quality NFL quarterback, now it seems like nobody wants him at this point. I mean, he's a guy right now, he's 30 years old. I mean, granted, he's not young, but at the same time, according to DraftKings.com at their sports book, the 3 quarterbacks that are available, the 3 biggest names, Cam Newton, Jameis Winston, and Andy Dalton, are all looking for new teams. And who is the favorite for all 3 of those to sign one of those quarterbacks is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And obviously, Jameis is not returning to Tampa Bay with Brady there. Cam has been released by the Panthers, and Andy Dalton is not returning to the Bengals. So do you buy into the fact that these quarterbacks, any of these 3 would even go to Jacksonville to back up Gardner Minshew with Foles now in Chicago?
I mean, I think they would go. I think Jameis would go to Jacksonville. Again, if the money's right, all of that would be for all, the case for all 3 of these guys. But you go into, if you're Dalton, if you're Newton, or if you're Winston, you go into that situation thinking you're going to beat him out in preseason. Minshew didn't even have a great preseason last season, as a rookie. And he had to play the entire time because Foles came in injured. He got the most snaps out of anybody last preseason. I watched every one of those games. He was kind of mediocre, and he certainly played much better as the season went along. But, yeah, those guys, as many starts as they've made in this league, you have to go in there, at least personally, thinking you're going to be able to beat him out for a gig. And as far as a fall from grace thing, yeah, Cam Newton's efficiency has really plummeted, but he has been playing injured. It's been a shoulder injury. He hasn't been able to throw. When he was able to at least gut through it in the early part of the season, the Panthers' offense looked good. I think we're seeing another situation just to transition some, not that I don't like Teddy Bridgewater, but we're going to get another year where the Panthers are rebuilding in a new system, and Christian McCaffrey's efforts are going to be wasted again.
Now, bringing that up, Tony, I wanted to look back at last year, and I found this very interesting, that you had a grand total of 7 new coaches in the NFL. All right? You had 7 new coaches. How many of those coaches, Tony, off the top of your head, finished above 500?
0, probably.
1, Matt LaFleur of the Packers.
Okay.
And the reason why you probably don't think of him is because they have Aaron Rodgers. So it's not like saying, oh, well, you coached a brand new quarterback, and you had Aaron Rodgers, who was great. Now, here are the other head coaches, just to put in perspective. Cliff Kingsbury, who actually didn't do a bad job in Arizona with a new quarterback, with Kyler Murray. They went 5-10-1 in a tough division. Zach Taylor with Cincinnati, they were a disaster, 2-14. They have the top pick of the draft. Vic Fangio, the Broncos, went 7-9, which actually isn't a terrible job because they had the quarterback carousel. Brian Flores went 5-11 with the Dolphins, who were supposed to be much worse. Adam Gase went 7-9 with the Jets, and Bruce Arians went 7-9 with the Buccaneers. And we see what Arians is Brady this year, so that's going to change things a bit. And even in the previous year, in 2018, out of the coaches that started in 2018, Matt Nagy, great first year at Chicago, not so great second year. Matt Patricia's been terrible in Detroit. Frank Reich, one playoff appearance, average last year in Indianapolis. John Gruden's 11-21 in 2 seasons with the Raiders. Mike Vrabel has made the playoffs once. So I'm bringing this point up because now let's look ahead to the coaches for this year. You have 5 new head coaches, and I'm going to go from back to front. I don't even know how I'm going this way. Ron Rivera in Washington, Joe Judge with the Giants, Mike McCarthy in Dallas, Kevin Stefanski in Cleveland, and Matt Rule in Carolina. That's why I bring this up when you said Teddy Bridgewater, that I'm kind of curious to see Carolina in a not-so-easy division and seeing what their win total is for this season. And Carolina right now at 5.5 wins over/under. So, Tony, with all that being said, kind of curious, with all these first-year head coaches struggling, where Carolina is going to be. You have Christian McCaffrey, but also we'll see if Teddy Bridgewater can stay healthy.
Right. I think they're a 4 or 5 win team. I would take the under. You figure that they added Robbie Anderson, so they'll have some weapons, but they're going to struggle. They lost Luke Kuechly, so the whole defense is going to be revamped, and that division just got a lot tougher. So, yeah, I don't have high hopes for Carolina. And of the coaches you mentioned, all of them are going to fail with a possible exception of Stefanski, who has nowhere to go but up with the Browns, considering expectations and how they were so terrible last year. And then obviously the Cowboys with McCarthy, who's supposed to pick up from where Jason Garrett left off and take that team, in a positive direction.
Well, and with Ron Rivera, who coached Cam Newton in Carolina, they just signed Kyle Allen. They don't know what their quarterback situation is because Dwayne Haskins, will he start the season? Would the Redskins go in a different direction in the draft? It doesn't seem that way. That Chase Young out of Ohio State could be their guy at number 2. So Ron Rivera, even though he's had success as a head coach in the NFL, Matt Rule, first time as a head coach in the NFL, Stefanski, first time as a head coach in the NFL, Joe Judge, who was with the Patriots, first time as a head coach in the NFL. He's got one of the best offensive weapons in the league with Saquon Barkley, but still Daniel Jones, who's very young at quarterback. You mentioned McCarthy, who's got obviously the most pieces of anybody from those teams and the success he had in Green Bay. But I'm really curious, going back to the Cam Newton thing, seeing the other favorites. Jacksonville was up there. The Chargers were up there because they have Tyrod Taylor as their quarterback. Now with Phillip Rivers gone. And you also had Washington. And I'm not too sure if Ron Rivera is going to go back to the well with Cam Newton just to bring him on as a backup.
No, I would imagine that the Redskins are going to be rebuilding. Cam probably wants to go to a winner. I think the Chargers are an interesting fit because, yeah, you battle Taylor. Taylor might even beat you out if Cam Newton isn't ready to go by the start of the season, but you really don't have to change that much in that system if Newton eventually takes over, and if his shoulder holds up, all of a sudden you have a more accurate deep ball passer and somebody that can be dynamic on a team that's going to, so long as they're healthy on defense with Derwin James back and those guys up front, be pretty formidable and have a shot to be. I think we mentioned on the last podcast that really, as far as AFC teams are concerned, you've got the division winners and every one of them has an overwhelming favorite. And then you kind of have to find 2 other teams. The Chargers could be one of those teams and the Steelers could be one of those teams just based on the strength of their defense that's coming back. And yes, certainly if I'm Cam Newton, I look at that as a situation where I can just get right back in the driver's seat of a team that can make the playoffs.
And quickly looking at Jameis Winston, now he's looking for a new home, and Jacksonville's the favorite at 5-2. The Chargers are 7-2. And another name that's kind of interesting, just because they're not really steady at the quarterback position, is Denver at 10-1. They have Drew Lock, who played at the end of last year. Joe Flacco, that experiment is done, which is not very shocking. I mean, the Broncos are a team that since John Elway took over, they've had so many issues at the quarterback position, and which is so odd considering John Elway was a legendary quarterback for that franchise, and they just could never find the right guy. I mean, even they had Peyton Manning towards the end of his career. They didn't have him in his prime. But do you take a flyer if you're the Broncos on Jameis Winston just because he's a proven starting quarterback in the league just to have on the roster?
No, I definitely do. I think you have to give Locke some competition in training camp, make sure that he earns that job. And you can go a different direction if somebody clearly beats him out, one of these veterans, even if it's Andy Dalton. That's a stopgap measure, whereas the other two are probably guys, Winston and Newton, if healthy, you can count on to be your starter for 16 games. But the point with the Broncos is they were in a lot of tight games last year that they absolutely lost, and they lost because of poor quarterback play in really heartbreaking fashion. They've got an emerging number one in Cortland Sutton. They add Melvin Gordon. They could potentially make a move, and I certainly think they should add a veteran to challenge Locke.
Yeah, when you look at even what the Broncos did last year, they had that 2-point loss to Chicago at the end at home. That Jacksonville game they blew, that they were up and they lost by 2 at home. They also lost that game at Indianapolis. I remember I had the Broncos in that game. They lost 15-13. They had a 4-point loss to Minnesota. They were a big early as a huge underdog. So that makes a difference. You go 7-9, which is not a bad job considering they started 0-4. They won 4 of their final 5 games to close out the season. I mean, you look back at it, if they just found a way to close out a few of those games, then maybe they're in the playoffs. And, you look at what Tennessee did last year with Ryan Tannehill. He came in after Marcus Mariota couldn't get things going, and Tannehill was a cast-off from Miami, and he just goes to Tennessee, and look what happened to them. I mean, granted, I'm not saying that Jameis Winston or Cam Newton would be a backup somewhere and take their team to the conference championship, but it can happen to have one of these, I hate saying proven guys, but a guy that's played the position before, backing up someone who maybe is, not a guy that you really trust that would be a championship type quarterback.
And what do you think about, obviously in the AFC East, the Bills will challenge the Patriots with no Brady there, but you still favor New England. AFC West, clearly Kansas City. In the AFC North, it's obviously Baltimore's show. AFC South, do you view Tennessee as heavy a favorite as I do? Or do you like what Indianapolis has done with Phillip Rivers, and obviously Jacksonville, if they pick the right quarterback, has a chance to be there? Or did the Titans do enough to convince you that they should be the team that runs away with that division?
They went on that huge run last season. Are they a team that should be playing for the AFC Championship? Not necessarily. That they caught, I think, New England and Baltimore kind of off guard. But when you look at the 4 teams in the division, it's hard to trust Houston with the way things have gone sideways this offseason. I just wonder how much Phillip Rivers has left in the tank. That's really what I'm concerned about, because the Chargers last year, man, he just made so many bad throws. You can't have 4 interception games, and he played so bad in that Raider game on that Thursday night, making some horrible throws early. They actually came back and took the lead late in that game before losing. But even the Chiefs game in Mexico, just bad decisions, and I just wonder how much he has left in the tank. And T.Y. Hilton was hurt a lot last year. Marlon Mack was hurt. So it'll be helpful if those guys are healthy this year. And Frank Reich is still a decent coach. But Jacksonville's got a long way to go. But Tennessee, it's going to be like it is every year, Tony. It's going to be a 9-7 team winning that division. You just don't know who it's going to be. That's why it's so hard to even make a convincing argument for any of them, just because they're all kind of the same.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that 9-7 has typically won that division. To me, I think Tennessee, if they can keep Derrick Henry healthy and Tannehill gives them some consistency, I like them as a 30-1 long shot in the AFC to potentially be that team where I wouldn't mind throwing a few bucks on, because I am a believer in them. I guess I like Byard in the secondary. You answered my question on that. You're in wait and see mode on the Titans.
And another Bet and Collect podcast is in the books, and hopefully next week we'll have some more news or better news with things coming back around. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can find us on Spotify as well as Apple Play and Google Play. Also, now you can find our podcast on YouTube, as you can listen to it on there if you want to find us on the Vegas Insider channel as well. For Tony Mejia, I am Kevin Rogers. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. Be safe out there. Been listening to the Bet and Collect podcast right here on VegasInsider.com.